Ever thought about how the things you know best, maybe things you interact with every day, might have a secret history you've never really considered? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into something incredibly familiar, yet surprisingly unknown to many: the fascinating historical journey of how the Bible actually came to be. We're aiming to go beyond just reading the words on the page, to truly understand the profound, often really twist-filled journey of these ancient texts. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to being genuinely well-informed about the Bible's origins. Now, up to this point, we spent quite a bit of time charting the course of Paul's epistles and his ministry. That whole period from, AD 48 until his martyrdom around AD 67, we've really immersed ourselves in that era. But now we're shifting our focus a bit to what are called the General Epistles.
Exactly. And, while many of us might think we know the Bible pretty well, today's deep dive is going to reveal some, honestly, truly surprising facts about how it actually came to us. We're going to focus specifically on these general epistles and then zoom out to look at the intricate, often challenging process of canonization, how the books got chosen. What's really fascinating here is the sheer depth of historical context that shaped these writings, and eventually their inclusion in the Bible.
Right. That historical context is so crucial. And that brings us to our mission for today, really. We want to understand the crucible that gave birth to these letters, the intense pressures faced by those early believers, and the long, fascinating, sometimes confusing journey that led to the Bible we hold in our hands today.
Okay, so let's unpack this first thing. We spent a lot of time with Paul's letters, very specific audiences mostly. But now we're moving our focus to these general epistles, or sometimes called Catholic epistles. What makes them different? Well, general epistles is basically just a term used to distinguish them from Paul's letters. Pretty simple distinction, really. The key characteristic is usually how they're named. Paul's letters, as you said, are mostly named after the recipients. Think 1 and 1 Timothy, or Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, specific churches or people. But the general epistles, they use the name of the sender. So you get James 1 until Peter, 1, 2, 3, John, and Jude. And another interesting characteristic is that the recipients who they were writing to is often uncertain. It's more general, hence the name, I suppose. Also, in terms of their format, even though we call them epistles or letters, some don't actually look like typical letters. Like James doesn't really conclude like a letter usually does. And 1 John, it doesn't begin or end like one. It feels much closer to a sermon almost.
Okay, so these aren't just polite updates or theological treatises then. They often get called persecution epistles. Why that specific label?
That's right. Because as we look at the timeline, these letters were largely written precisely because direct persecution against the early church had started to ramp up. They were penned in a situation where God's church, the one established through the fulfillment of the new covenant, was experiencing immense difficulty and confusion. And this came from both external persecution and internal false teachings cropping up, which naturally raises a big question. What exactly were these difficulties?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. To grasp these letters properly, we really have to step back and look at the historical pressure cooker of that first century. What were the main forces really persecuting the church back then?
There were primarily two major forces pushing against them. First, you had the Jewish legalists. These were centered in Jerusalem, think high priests, temple aristocracy, the Pharisees. We saw this with Paul, right? Wherever he went, he consistently faced death threats from certain Jewish groups. Why? Because his core message, that temple sacrifices, festivals, circumcisions, all that was fulfilled by Jesus' offering, it fundamentally shook the Jewish identity of the time. And that made it incredibly difficult even for Jewish Christians to accept fully. Then the second major force was the Roman leadership. The emperors, the governors. You have to imagine this relentless, century-long pressure on the early church. It really kicked off with emperors like Nero. After the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, he scapegoated Christians and initiated what church history calls the first of 10 great Roman persecutions of Christians. Unquote. Brutal stuff. Later, you had Emperor Domitian, starting around 80-85 onwards. He continued the persecution, often forcing Christians to choose between their faith and their lives, especially over things like emperor worship.
This was an absolute crucible for their faith and also for the texts, the letters, that sustained them through it. And this wasn't short-lived. This kind of severe, continuous persecution by about 10 different emperors went on for over 100 years, right up until Christianity was officially recognized in AD 313.
Wow. And it wasn't just the Christians facing this immense pressure, right? The Jewish people themselves were locked in this constant struggle with Rome, too. That led to some absolutely devastating revolts that completely reshaped their world. Can you walk us through that period a bit?
Absolutely. It's a crucial backdrop. From roughly AD 60 to AD 100, the Jewish people, especially those centered in Jerusalem, faced continuous discrimination and persecution from Rome, and the Herodian dynasty Rome had installed. Things boiled over in AD 66. They rebelled in what we now call the First Jewish Revolt, but it was ultimately crushed by AD 70, and the result was the complete collapse of the Jewish region of Jerusalem, the temple destroyed, the city ravaged. Then fast forward a bit to the AD 130s under Emperor Hadrian. He inspected the ruins of the Jewish region and decided to build a Roman colonial city right near Jerusalem. He stationed the Roman 10th Legion there, a real show of force. And then, critically, he forbade circumcision for Jews.
He forbade circumcision. Wow.
Yes, a direct attack on their religious and cultural identity. This, understandably, sparked a second revolt in AD 132. It lasted about 3 years, but it was brutally suppressed. Estimates are around 600,000 deaths. Huge numbers of Jews were captured and sold into slavery, so many, in fact, that the price of slaves reportedly plummeted in the markets. And as a direct result of these revolts, Hadrian took another step. He changed the name of the entire region from Judea to Palestine.
Palestine? Why Palestine?
It likely referred to the Philistines, ancient enemies of Israel. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the Jewish connection to the land. He then expelled all Jews from Jerusalem itself, turning it into a pagan city by erecting a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. So the Jewish people, expelled from their holy city, really began the long diaspora, living scattered around the world until the modern state of Israel was reestablished in 1948. Now, if we connect these historical struggles back to the General Epistles, the picture becomes clearer. The persecution from Jewish legalists seems to have prompted the writing of James and Hebrews, which addressed Jewish Christians grappling with the law. The broader Roman leadership persecution, under emperors like Nero, likely prompted 1 and 2 Peter and Jude, which talk a lot about suffering faithfully. And then as we get past AD 80, Domitian's enforced emperor worship seems to be the backdrop for 1, 2, and 3 John, dealing with staying true to Christ versus conforming to pagan demands, and the book of Revelation itself. That intense vision was recorded right during the peak of Domitian's reign of terror, around AD 93 to 96.
Okay, so these letters really emerged from incredible hardship, from intense historical moments. But then how did these specific books, out of potentially many early Christian writings floating around, come to be recognized as authoritative scripture, as the Bible we know today? This hits on a question a lot of people have. Was the Bible just, decided by a few powerful people in some back room?
That's a really common question and a great one. The answer isn't a simple yes or no. It's much more nuanced. First, maybe let's briefly touch on the Old Testament canon. For the Jewish scriptures, the Council of Jamnia, around AD 90, is often cited as confirming the 39 books that Protestants recognize today. Now, there were some minor debates even then about books like Esther or Song of Songs, but most were pretty widely accepted already. It was more of a confirmation. The New Testament canon, though, faced a really unique set of challenges. You have to picture the early church scene. It was a bit chaotic. There were countless letters and writings circulating. Some were genuine apostolic writings, but some were outright fakes, pushing strange ideas. Plus, you had new heresies popping up constantly, like Marcionism. Marcion basically wanted to ditch the Old Testament entirely and large parts of the New. And Gnosticism, which claimed you needed secret knowledge for salvation. All these different writings were circulating, but there wasn't always a clear consensus on which books truly held divine authority.
So this created a really deep need to establish clear criteria for what should be considered scripture for the canon. The church, over time, gradually recognized differences in lists used by various regions, and they started seeking unity. They developed criteria like, was it connected to an apostle? That's apostolicity. Was it widely accepted and used by churches everywhere? That's universality. Did its teachings align with the core faith handed down? That's orthodoxy. Was it actually being used in church worship and teaching? That's ecclesiastical reception. The key thing to grasp here is that this was a long process. It wasn't a snap decision. It was decades, even centuries, of examination, use, and growing agreement among church communities. Not a sudden decree by one person or one council. Now, councils like the Council of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 and later in 419, they played a crucial role. But their role was largely and officially ratifying and confirming the consensus that had already been building organically within the regional churches for a long time. They were basically saying, yes, these are the books we all recognize.
Okay, that makes sense. It was more of a recognition than a selection, in a way. Let's maybe zoom in on one example that really highlights this journey. The book of Hebrews, it sounds like it had a particularly dramatic path to canonization, what stands out about Hebrews?
Oh, Hebrews is a fantastic example of this process, yeah. It was one of what scholars sometimes call the seven disputed books, or the anti-logumena. That's just a Greek term meaning spoken against. This group also included James, 2:8 or 2 and 3, John, Jude, and Revelation. Books that took a bit longer to be universally accepted everywhere. Hebrews specifically faced a lot of debate and controversy right up until the very end. And the main sticking point, its authorship. Who actually wrote it? See, the Eastern Church, folks in places like Alexandria and Antioch from the 2nd century onwards, generally recognized it as a work of Paul, or at least Pauline in authority, and so they accepted its canonicity pretty early on. But the Western Church, over in Rome and North Africa, represented by influential figures like Tertullian, they recognized its apostolic authority. They thought maybe Barnabas wrote it, someone connected to the apostles, but they didn't initially accept it onto their official canonical list.
So different views in different places.
Exactly. It took time for consensus. Hebrews was finally formally accepted as canonical by the West, along with the East confirming the whole list, at the Sixth Council of Carthage in AD 419. So let's circle back to that question. Was the Bible decided by people? Based on this history, the formation of the canon wasn't really due to external compulsion or just human whim. It seems to have been achieved more through the inherent authority, truthfulness, and persuasiveness of the biblical texts themselves. These scriptures resonated. They had already undergone this long-standing theological consensus building within the church communities of the time. They were already being used as scripture. So in a way, they were naturally recognized as canonical over time. You could say God worked through all things that happened in the context of time and relationships with people he created, allowing countless people of that era to clearly discern what contained God's clear will. The 66 books we have were organically accepted. And regarding Hebrews' unknown author, well, while it was eventually canonized, partly because its content was seen as identical to Paul's thought, later scholarly research generally concluded its specific author is unknown. This leads to the common conclusion that really only God knows the author of Hebrews. But the belief is that God's clear work intervened, ensuring this powerful message came to us as scripture, regardless of who held the pen.
Okay, so that's a fascinating journey. What does all this mean for us today then? When we pick up our Bibles, why is all this historical background, this context, so crucial for your reading experience for the listener?
It's absolutely vital because understanding the who, to whom, when, and why, the basic context is paramount for correct interpretation. If that information is missing, or if we ignore it, like potentially with Hebrews if we didn't know its background, interpretation becomes incredibly difficult, maybe even unreliable. And here's a clear warning, I think.
Yeah.
If you read a text without trying to understand the author's original intention, what they were trying to convey to their first audience, well, then it might not actually be God's will speaking to us through that word anymore. Instead, we might just interpret it however we wish, based on our feelings or preconceptions. We risk falling into the delusion that our own thoughts are the truth. And it could easily become just a self-interpretation, maybe something that feels good, but is actually irrelevant to God's complete intention in giving us that text.
That reminds me of, that movie, The Matrix? I remember hearing stories of people in churches feeling really blessed by it, thinking it was almost like a Christian allegory expressing the triune God or something. But then the director, who later came out as transgender, actually stated in an interview that they made it to convey the meaning of homosexuality to people. It's just a powerful reminder, isn't it? Regardless of whether you like an interpretation or feel good about it, to understand the content correctly and completely, you have to try and understand the author's original intention.
Precisely. That's a great illustration. Therefore, when you want to read the Bible correctly, really understand it. And instead of just jumping into the content blindly, you should always take the time. Take time to thoroughly understand the introductory parts of that specific book, who wrote it, when, why, to whom, all that background stuff. Yes, it might seem like a slower process digging into introductions and context, but it's actually a fundamentally important step if you want to correctly meet God's true intention without straying into your own ideas.
So thinking about that for yourself, for you listening right now, as you approach and read the Bible today, have you truly prepared yourself to know God's true intention? Or have you maybe just read it a bit blindly sometimes, seeking only what you feel in the moment or what touches your heart, without considering that deeper context?
Yeah, and reflecting on this whole deep dive, thinking about the historical twists and turns, how the Bible actually came to us from those intense persecutions we talked about to the slow, careful, deliberate process of canonization. It really reminds us that these aren't just ancient texts gathering dust. They represent God's genuine heart, delivered to us through a really challenging yet clearly guided journey.
Hmm.
How does knowing this history, knowing the struggle and the process, deepen your appreciation for the Bible? And how might it shape how you engage with it going forward?
Let this history encourage you, maybe, to cherish the Bible even more deeply. Reflect on the sacrifices made, the historical pressures, and the divine guidance that ultimately brought these words to you today.